And India is reportedly making drastic shifts in its oil sources. Now, tilting more toward West Africa and West Asia, Donald Trump imposed 50% tariffs on India. 25% of these tariffs are additional, and they were imposed because of India's purchase of Russian crude.
The world is shifting. The power that once made nations tremble no longer carries the same weight. For decades, U.S. sanctions and threats were enough to break economies and silence leaders. But today, things are changing. Across the globe, countries are refusing to bow. They are standing tall, choosing their own path, and challenging the so-called superpower. And one of the most surprising players in this new movement is India. Yes, India, a nation once heavily tied to U.S. interests, has just turned away from American crude oil. Instead, it struck a bold deal with Nigeria, a move that caught many off guard and left Washington watching from the sidelines. But why would India make such a daring shift? Was it just about cheaper oil, or was it about something far bigger, freedom from U.S. control and the search for true independence? For Nigeria, this partnership opens the door to new wealth, stronger trade, and global recognition. For India, it means securing vital energy supplies without being chained to American influence. Together, they are rewriting the rules of power and trade in the modern world. And the bigger question remains, if India can break free, how many more nations will follow? How long before the world stops fearing American sanctions altogether? A few days ago, India's state-owned Indian Oil Corporation made a move that sent ripples through global markets. In its latest procurement round, IOC turned away from U.S. crude and placed its bet elsewhere. Instead, it purchased 3 million barrels of oil from West Africa and the Middle East. According to trade sources, the breakdown was clear: 2 million barrels from West Africa and another million from the Middle East. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Of the 2 million barrels from Africa, half came directly from Nigeria. The other half from use in oil grades controlled by French energy giant Total Energies. On the surface, it looked like just another oil deal. But beneath it, this was something far more strategic, a signal that India's energy security path is shifting, and that the US is no longer the only power dictating the game. In addition to the West African deal, IOC also secured 1 million barrels of Abu Dhabi's Das crude from Shell. The Nigerian shipments were purchased free on board, while the Das crude was delivered straight to Indian ports. All of it is expected to arrive between late October and early November. Perfect timing to fuel India's refineries during the peak demand season. But here's the twist. Just 1 week before this purchase, the very same IOC had bought 5 million barrels of U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude. Think about that. Just last week, America was India's main supplier. And now, almost overnight, India has shifted its focus to West Africa and the Middle East. What does this really mean? Was it just a change in price, or is it something deeper? Because from the way it looks, this isn't just a one-time detour. This could be the beginning of India walking away from U.S. crude, and it doesn't seem like a temporary move at all. Through September, Indian refineries are set to receive multiple shipments of Nigerian crude. These deliveries follow a string of spot market deals that began around the end of July. But the real question is, why did India suddenly choose this path? The answer lies in a familiar story: America's habit of meddling in the affairs of other nations and demanding that things be done on its terms. When the war between Russia and Ukraine erupted, the US and Europe loudly announced a boycott of Russian oil. On the surface, it looked like a united front, a punishment for Moscow. But behind closed doors, the story was far murkier. Both the EU and the US quietly continued to buy Russian crude through indirect channels. The hypocrisy was glaring, but not our focus today. India, however, saw an opening. With Russian oil selling at steep discounts, New Delhi moved quickly. Within months, India became the single largest buyer of Russian seaborne crude. Officials in New Delhi argued that their purchases weren't just self-interest, they kept the global market balanced at a time of crisis. Of course, Europe and the United States grumbled about India's decision, but there was little they could do. India is a sovereign nation, and as an Asian giant, it reserves the right to chart its own course. But then came Donald Trump. A man who likes to style himself as a peace broker decided that grumbling wasn't enough. He wanted to show the world the so-called power of the United States. Instead of focusing on his grand ambition to mediate peace between Russia and Ukraine, Trump turned his attention to India. a country with no direct role in the war. His accusation was simple but sharp. By buying Russian oil, India was funding Russia's war machine. And then came the blow. Trump slapped India with a 50% import tariff. 50%, an unprecedented punishment for a nation simply trying to secure its own energy needs. The irony? Both the US and Europe continued to buy Russian oil through indirect channels. They were guilty of the very same thing, yet Trump never dared to impose the same tariffs on Europe. Once again, the hypocrisy of the West was on full display. While trade between the US and Russia has dropped by 90% since the war began, the numbers tell a different story. Just last year, the US still imported more than $3 billion worth of Russian goods. Fertilizers, palladium, uranium, even plutonium. And the Europeans? The very partners who joined Washington in sanctions against Moscow still kept their trade channels open. In 2024 alone, EU-Russia trade was worth nearly $42 billion. Oil, natural gas, iron, steel, fertilizers, the very lifelines of Russia's economy. So the question is obvious. If America and Europe are also fueling Russia's war machine, why didn't Trump impose tariffs on them? Why only India? Not surprisingly, New Delhi pushed back. Indian officials hurled the same accusations back at Washington, calling out US hypocrisy for what it was. And most importantly, India made its position crystal clear. It will keep buying Russian oil for as long as it remains economical. India's finance minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, put it bluntly in a television interview. We will have to take a call which supply source suits us the best, so we will undoubtedly be buying it. She reminded the world that most of India's foreign exchange reserves are spent on crude oil and refined fuels, and that energy security comes before American approval. In response, U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick stepped forward on Friday with a warning. He urged India to back the dollar, return to trade talks with Washington, and stop buying Russian oil. We're always willing to talk. The Chinese sell to us. The Indians sell to us. They're not going to be able to sell to each other. We are the consumer of the world. But his words sounded less like confidence and more like delusion. The secretary seemed to forget one of humanity's most powerful traits, the ability to adapt. Yes, the US has a massive market of over 300 million people, but it is not the only one. Africa, the Middle East, Asia, together they hold markets that rival or even surpass America's. The age of the US threatening nations with its consumer base is fading, and countries like India are beginning to realize it. India's finance minister put it in clear terms. Whether it is Russian oil or anything else, it's our decision to buy from the place which suits our needs. Whether in terms of rates, logistics, anything. She added that Indian refiners resumed buying from Russia almost immediately after the higher US tariffs were announced. For India, the message is simple. Washington's threats will not dictate its choices. But how does Nigeria come into the picture? To understand this, we need to rewind a little. Before the clash with Trump and the heavy tariffs, Indian refiners had been steadily raising their purchases of US oil. On the surface, it made sense. America had positioned itself as a reliable supplier, and those imports even helped reduce India's massive trade surplus with Washington. For a time, it looked like a marriage of convenience, mutually beneficial, politically safe. But beneath that arrangement was a problem nobody in Washington wanted to talk about. The numbers didn't add up. Reports showed that the landing cost of US crude was consistently higher than other grades. Even with the Brent WTI price spread sitting at about $4 a barrel, American oil was simply too expensive compared to alternatives on the global market. For Indian refiners already struggling with tight margins and rising domestic demand, this was a red flag. Then came Trump's decision, a sudden punishing 50% tariff on Indian goods, an attempt to force India back in line. That was the breaking point. For New Delhi, the math was now undeniable. US oil was not only costly, it was politically dangerous. And so, the search began for alternatives. This is where Nigeria steps into the spotlight. For decades, Nigeria had been one of the top 3 suppliers of crude to India. Nigerian grades, particularly light sweet crude, were perfect for India's refineries and cheaper to transport compared to many other sources. But when the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, everything changed. Russia began offering its crude at steep discounts to keep exports flowing. For Indian refiners chasing the lowest possible costs, the lure of cheap Russian oil was irresistible. Nigeria was quietly pushed aside. India turned its gaze northward, buying massive volumes of Russian crude. Washington complained, Brussels frowned, but India pressed on. For a while, Russia became India's energy lifeline. Nigeria, once a central player, faded into the background. But now the cycle has turned again. With U.S. oil priced out by tariffs and Russian supplies under political scrutiny, Nigeria has re-emerged as the pragmatic choice. For New Delhi, this isn't just about buying oil. It's about diversifying risk, securing energy, and keeping Washington at arm's length. For Abuja, it's an opportunity to reclaim one of its biggest customers and strengthen its role as Africa's top oil producer. The return of India to Nigerian crude could mark more than just a trade shift. It could signal a deeper strategic alignment between Asia's rising giant and Africa's largest economy. A partnership forged not under American influence, but in defiance of it. And as the tankers set sail from West Africa to the Indian coast, one question lingers in the background. Is this the start of a new era for Nigeria and India, or just the first move in a much larger reshuffling of global power? If Nigeria manages to cement its position as an alternative supplier to India, the rewards could be enormous. Remember, India is not only the world's largest country by population, it is also the market with the fastest growing demand for oil. For Nigeria, tapping into that demand could mean stability in export earnings, even in an era of cutthroat competition for crude buyers. But not everyone is convinced this is a turning point. Some experts warn that India's recent purchases from Nigeria may not yet be a game changer. Their first concern is the same question that keeps resurfacing. Will Indian refiners eventually buckle under US pressure and reduce imports of Russian oil? The official response from New Delhi has been crystal clear. The finance minister herself has said this is highly unlikely. India will buy oil where it suits its needs, regardless of Washington's opinion. And here's the reality. Russia alone cannot meet India's massive appetite. That's why, even in the midst of controversy, India kept buying from the US as well, which means if Nigeria plays its cards right, it can step into the vacuum the US leaves behind. The second challenge is Nigeria's own capacity. Critics argue that the country doesn't have the space to ramp up production quickly enough to satisfy India's growing needs. But opportunities do exist. The giant Dangote refinery, now running at full capacity, has already transformed Nigeria's domestic oil landscape. It absorbs a large chunk of local production, reducing what's available for export. At the same time, interestingly, Dangote itself relies on imported crude, much of it from the US. This creates a paradox. On one hand, Nigeria must fuel its own refineries to achieve energy independence. On the other, it must free up enough crude to seize opportunities abroad, especially with powerful buyers like India. If Nigeria can balance these two priorities, it could emerge not only as India's new partner, but as a global energy force reclaiming its rightful place on the world stage. Of course, there's one more obstacle: distance. Nigeria and India are separated by thousands of miles, and long shipping routes add to the cost of every barrel. I think some oil will get there as the oil production levels increase, notes Agwu Ojawu, an advisor at Consultancy Africa Practice. In other words, the logistics aren't simple. But even with these challenges, the deal between India and Nigeria is a win. And this isn't the first time the two nations have joined hands. Both countries share ties within the BRICS framework, India as a full member, Nigeria as a partner. Just last year, the two sides finalized a major trade agreement that shocked many in the global market. They agreed to use their own currencies instead of the dollar. At the time, it raised eyebrows. After all, both India and Nigeria had strong relationships with the United States. Yet today, those ties are not what they used to be. Washington's pressure and tariffs have pushed India closer to other partners, and Nigeria is stepping forward to fill the gap. This shift became even clearer when a 7-member Indian delegation, led by Amardeep Singh Bhatia from the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, traveled to Abuja. Joined by the High Commissioner of India, they sat down with Nigerian officials in a joint trade committee meeting. The statement that followed was telling. Both sides carried out a detailed review of their trade and investment ties. They pinpointed key areas where cooperation could grow and outlined plans for mutually beneficial investments. It wasn't just talk, it was strategy, a clear sign that India and Nigeria are preparing for a deeper, more resilient partnership. The areas of cooperation go far beyond oil. Both sides agreed to resolve market access issues and deepen ties in crucial sectors: crude oil and natural gas, pharmaceuticals, financial technology through India's unified payments interface, and even the local currency settlement system. The meeting concluded with a powerful message. Both nations would work toward finalizing the currency settlement agreement as quickly as possible, cutting dependence on the dollar and strengthening their economic bond. When you look at it this way, India's decision to buy Nigerian crude oil begins to make perfect sense. Out of all the oil-producing countries in Africa, Nigeria already had the groundwork laid. The deals, the discussions, the agreements, they were already in motion. All India had to do was act. And the numbers back this up. Today, Nigeria stands as India's second-largest trading partner in all of Africa. Bilateral trade between the two countries reached $11.8 billion in 2023 alone. The partnership is not symbolic, it's concrete, it's growing, and it's backed by money on the ground. In fact, India has invested heavily in Nigeria. With a total of $27 billion already in place, more than 135 Indian companies are operating in the Nigerian market. Their footprint spans infrastructure, manufacturing, consumer goods, and services, evidence of a relationship that extends far beyond crude oil, and the momentum is only building. In September 2023, Nigeria secured nearly $14 billion in pledges from Indian investors, marking a new phase of economic cooperation. For both nations, the message is clear. This is not a short-term alliance. This is the beginning of something much bigger. According to the Nigerian spokesperson, India's Jindal Steel and Power has committed to pump $3 billion into Nigeria's steel sector, and Indorama Corp plans to invest an additional $8 billion to expand its petrochemical facility in Nigeria. Meanwhile, Nigeria approved a $1 billion partnership agreement with the Indian government to help the Defense Industries Corporation of Nigeria attain 40% self-sufficiency in local manufacturing and production of defense equipment in 3 years. All these agreements between India and Nigeria indicate that both countries are committed to bolstering trade ties, and the recent local currency settlement system agreement signed by both countries is a step in that direction. This decision to trade without the dollar comes as both countries are currently facing pressure from international markets and have decided to join forces to face these challenges. By taking this step, India, as a member of BRICS, demonstrates its commitment to autonomy and independence in its economic dealings. With the current oil acquisition, the relation between India and Nigeria has no doubt significantly strengthened. Meanwhile, the US is left looking on the sidelines, wondering what's going on. The truth is that the world has changed, a change that began gradually with the Russian-Ukraine war. From the war, it moved to BRICS, calling for a multipolar world and calling out the hegemony and hypocrisy of the West. And then it moved to the Sahel region, where Western influence has reduced dramatically thanks to the military leaders. This drop in Western influence has also spread across the African continent, with more nations turning away from the West to non-Western countries. Anyone with eyes can clearly see that the power the West, and in particular the US, once held is no more. Despite the sanctions and threats, more and more countries are rising up to stand against the hegemony of the US and the West. It would seem that the only people who have not realized this is the US and the West. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel.